Hey guys, Mrs. Kraz here. We're ending chapter 19 with a short section, section 4, Struggles for Justice. Alright, so we're going to start with rights for African Americans. We have two public figures that are going to play a very big role in gaining more rights for African Americans at this time period. So one is Booker T. Washington. And to look at some of his background, he was born into slavery. He taught himself to read. He worked in coal mines, and he attended school when he could. His approach to African Americans' rights were that African Americans need to focus on educating themselves and holding jobs, right? Basically, he's saying, you do what you need to do, right? Live the best life you can. And over time, you're going to gain more money. You're going to gain more respect from people around you, and therefore you're going to gain more power to make changes in society, right? Specifically, Washington thought, like, if you are, you want to build up your own credentials, right? And then when you demand equality, you've already proven that you deserve it, right? He built some trade schools for African Americans in service of this. Here, like, learn a craft, educate yourself, do what you do and do it well, and show them that you deserve the rights to be equal. W.E.B. Du Bois played it a little bit differently. So his background is very different from Washington's. He was a scholar, and he was the first African American to ever receive a PhD from Harvard. He thinks that Washington's approach is wrong, right? We don't need to prove that we deserve equality. We do. It's implicit. Of course we do. So he said African Americans needed to fight, and they needed to fight vocally for equal rights. Du Bois formed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, and this group was all about pushing for rights for African Americans and trying to gain equality where they could. So African Americans weren't the only ones struggling. Mexican Americans also faced segregation pretty regularly. So now in 1910, Mexican immigration increased because of a revolution and famine in Mexico. Mexicans wanted to escape these poor conditions and the political unrest that's there in their country. So many Mexicans immigrated to America, and here they worked as field hands, they built roads or dug irrigation ditches often. Some worked in factories, and we're seeing a wage gap between people of all races, genders, etc., and it continues here. Often Mexican Americans were paid less than other workers. Mexican American families tried to retain their home culture by establishing barrios or Mexican ethnic neighborhoods where their culture could still thrive. We've seen this type of thing in previous sections. So looking at Asian Americans, and we don't spend too much time looking closely at Asian Americans because most of the struggles they're facing are on the West Coast, and we in New York State just focus more on what's going on here, with our own history, but this is nevertheless very significant. So many Asian immigrants settled on the Pacific Coast, where they mostly worked as farmers. Prejudice against Asians was very high. There was segregation being used in many cases, and people even wanted President Roosevelt to restrict Asian immigration. That's how high the prejudice levels were. Roosevelt was torn because, the people were pressuring him to do this, right? But he also didn't want to anger Japan specifically, who had a powerful army. So Roosevelt proposed a gentleman's agreement, an agreement that's not recorded in writing, it's not official, but because we are two gentlemen, we will respect each other and we will agree to these terms and work with them. And this was the agreement that does not sound so gentlemanly to me. So the agreement was that Japan would stop workers from coming to the U.S., but the U.S. would allow wives to come and join their husbands who were already here. That just sounds like racism to me. It doesn't sound so gentlemanly, but what have you. So there is a big, immigration from Japan is very much limited, but the fact that fewer immigrants are coming in does not at all end racism. In 1913, California even went so far as to ban Asians who weren't citizens from owning land. If you have immigrated, you can't buy land here. That's pretty extreme and pretty terrible. Okay, looking at some religious minorities at the time, and what do you know, this is already the last slide for today. You're welcome. So Catholics were considered a religious minority at the time. There were nativist groups like the Anti-Catholic American Protective Association who wanted to limit Catholic immigration, right? And remember, nativists are all about keeping the culture of our country intact. And I guess if you're thinking back to the times of pilgrims and whatnot, people did come here to seek religious freedom from Catholics, and maybe that's what they had in their mind. But we're pretty far past that, right? This should be a melting pot where people can live their ideals. But nevertheless, groups like this existed. There would be teachers in public schools that lectured against the Pope and said how bad he was. There would be textbooks, again, used in public schools that mentioned deceitful Catholics, which is ridiculous. So as a way of fighting back, Catholics established parochial schools or church-sponsored schools where students could be educated free from these pressures and biases that are, implicit in the system. Another religious minority at the time are the Jews. Anti-Semitism is very high, and anti-Semitism is the name for prejudice against Jews specifically. Jews were often wrongly accused of crimes, and the reason, how do you know they're guilty? Well, they're Jewish. Again, just what is logic? Not this, I'll tell you. So, as their own way of fighting back, Jews established the Anti-Defamation League, and defamation is the spread of false, hateful information, and this league worked to fight prejudice against Jews specifically. So that is where we're wrapping up for today. It brings us to the close of the Progressive Era, and we're moving on pretty soon to some pretty big things, but for now we're done. Have a great afternoon, guys.